Hey everyone, this is Pallavi and I'm back with the seventh game of the book, The Chess, The Art of Logical Thinking. This game was played between Adams and Saloff in Dortmund in 1992. The opening played was Sicilian Defence. From this game, we can learn when to break the classical rules or principles of chess and when not to. Let's start. E4. Occupying the center, making way for the f1 bishop and the queen to come out, controlling the d5 and f5 square. Give it another chance, white can play d4 and occupy another central square, controlling c5 and e5 square. So after e4, black plays c5, the Sicilian defense. This pawn move controls the d4 square from the side and opens up a diagonal from the d8 to f5 diagonal for the queen, and in future might come in handy, the c file might come in handy for queenside attack. Knight f3. Developing towards the center, supporting the d4 pawn, d4 square, which would help white to push the pawn to d4 with knight's support. Knight c6. Unlike the Sicilian lines, where black gradually builds a stable center with moves such as e6 or d6, Saloff takes a different approach here. He immediately challenges white's space advantage by prioritizing knight development over early pawn moves. d4. White eliminates the hindrance on c5 to establish control over the d4 square, although this advantage lasts for merely two moves. C takes d4. Black cannot allow the pawn on d4 to evade capture, for if e6, then the black knight can be driven away from its prized center post on c6 with d5. So black had to capture the pawn on d4. Knight captured the pawn on d4. In the usual Sicilian defense setup, white dominates the first four ranks on their side of the board, and black holds a strong position within their first three ranks. These areas are divided by an empty space along the fifth rank. However, this typical pattern doesn't apply here. So after knight takes d4, knight f6, developing towards the center and attacking the e4 pawn. Knight c3, white develops and supports the center and the e4 pawn. e5, the key move in the Sveshnikov variation, is notable. At first sight, it makes sense for black to establish a pawn center and counterattack white's spatial advantage, force the opponent's knight to move from its strong position on d4, clear the way for their king's bishop to develop while gaining time as capturing with knight takes c6, b takes c6 would strengthen black's center. That is why here now white played knight b d5. However, this is a demanding response. The downside of black's recent move is the creation of a backward pawn on the d5. d6. Black addresses the threat of knight d6 check. Then b takes d6, queen takes d6. When white has both bishops, still it leads to a lingering backward pawn. However, experience from many master games shows that despite being on an open file without pawn support, white struggles to capture it, the d7 pawn. An exception might occur if it reaches d4 square under rare circumstance. Then it would get a support from the e5 pawn. So after d6, now white played bishop to g5. Often the square in front of a backward pawn is a greater weakness than the pawn itself. In this case, the d5 square lacks defense from a black pawn. Thus, white aims to establish control over it as a central post for one of their knights, using the bishop to pin and prepare for knight d5 for capturing the knight and safeguarding the d5 square. Becomes a sensible move for white. a6. Black chooses a good moment to drive back the knight as white threatened knight d5 followed by knight bc7 check with a fork. So black played a6, white played knight a3, only plays for the knight. b5, another pawn advance that forces white to address the threat of b4 forking the knights, blocks the white bishop on f1 from using the c4 for attacks, halts the knight c4 and knight e3 maneuver, especially if the displaced knight returns to the center. So b5, white played bishop takes f6. White tactfully handles the situation, countering the b4 threat while executing the plan to dominate the d5 square. Of course, such an exchange demands careful assessment given that white is parting with their strong dark square bishop. G takes f6. It looks bad to recapture with pawn, but after queen takes f6 wastes too much time because of knight d5, queen d8, or else there is a fork on c7. So after this c4, then white has a dangerous initiative. So black had to capture with the pawn. Knight d5. A knight's best spot is in the middle where it can be easily pushed away, while the worst is at the boat's edge. So the knight in the middle is happy on d5 while the other on a3 is in a tough spot. Bishop g7. While black's kingside pawns have been moved around, it's not entirely negative. The bishop is actually pleased about the opening on g7 that has become available for it. c3. The knight on a3 appears disadvantaged, but its situation will soon change as white opens up space on c2, allowing the knight to return to the center swiftly. f5. Meanwhile, black utilizes the doubled pawns to their advantage, attacking the white center, eliminating the e4 pawn and keeping an additional f pawn in reserve for a potential attack along the f file. E takes f5. White gives up the b1 h7 diagonal for now. This helps white reposition their wandering knight by attacking the bishop on f5 with moves like knight c2 and knight e3. It also opens up the a8 h1 diagonal, which is good for white's other bishop. Now black played bishop cross f5. Bishop takes f5, captures and develops. Knight c2. All as planned, the white knight returns to the center and prepares to strengthen white's hold on the d5 square. Black played kingside castle. Although the black king's position on the king side isn't perfect due to the absence of the g pawn, the bishop on g7 provides strong defense against the potential attacks. Knight c e3. White strengthens the knight on d5 and takes a quick jab at the black bishop. Bishop e6. The bishop isn't worried about having to move back because black had to open space for f7 to f5 to counterplay in the center. The bishop chooses e6 over g6 because it's engaged in the struggle for the crucial d5 square. g3. White's main concern is the d5 square. So rather than developing the king's bishop with a standard move like bishop e2, white takes an extra step to place the bishop on the h1a8 diagonal by bishop g2. Sometimes it's important to move pieces quickly to avoid being overwhelmed, but in situations like this, a slower approach is necessary. White needs to position the pieces correctly, not rush them out to keep the advantage from the opening. Knight e7. Black doesn't just watch as white takes control of the center. Black moves his knight away from the long diagonal, expecting bishop g2 increases the pressure on d5. Bishop g2. The bishop enjoys a splendid diagonal already, and already black must attend to the threat of knight takes e7 check, queen takes e7, bishop takes a8, winning the exchange. So after bishop g2, black played rook b8. The rook wisely moves away from the risky diagonal. Placed on b8, it protects the b5 pawn, expecting white to possibly weaken the queen side with a2 to a4. Castle. White finally castles. The way his minor pieces are working together to control the d5 square is commendable. White is thinking about moves like a4 or queen d2 followed by rook a d1 for a future attack on the vulnerable d6 pawn. Meanwhile, black's move f5, f7 to f5 immediately shouldn't be underestimated as a form of counterplay. So after short castle here, black played knight takes d5. This trade benefits white by delaying the f7 to f5 move. It would have been wiser for black to play f5 immediately, as knight takes e7 check, queen takes knight, knight d5, queen d7 would create a finely balanced position. But black played knight takes d5. Now white played a good move, bishop takes d5. A knight on d5 would be nice, but it wouldn't prevent black from playing f5. However, with the move that was played in the game, black can't move the f pawn without losing the bishop on e6. Even if black captures on bishop takes d5, then queen takes d5, the pawn would still be pinned. Meanwhile, white would have control with moves like rook a d1 and then knight f5. So after bishop takes d5, black played king h8. Salov decides that it would be too slow to prepare f7 to f5 if indeed it is still a feasible plan. So he changes track and looks to activate his king's bishop. If, however, bishop h6, then bishop takes e6, f takes e6, queen g4 check would force the awkward king f7 to defend the e6 pawn. So first of all, he moves his king to the center on h8. White played a4. After stopping the f5 pawn plan, f5 pawn move plan, white focuses on the queen side. He wants to either make a weakness in black's pawns on a6 or control the a file for his rook. Bishop h6. Finally, the bishop becomes active on the board. However, a strategy that only involves the pieces won't be as strong as one that also uses the majority pawns in the center. 8x b5. This is a crucial point where black must discover the right move to break free from the dangerous situation that Adams is skillfully creating. 8x b5. Sometimes automatic recaptures can be fatal blunders. Now the white rook on a1 gets a great open path that it can use to get into black's queen side. It was really important for black to lessen the pressure by trading several pieces like bishop takes e3, then f takes e3, bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, rook takes b5 attacking the queen, queen d2, a5. This move would lead to a situation where black would hold the endgame with queens and rooks, and the traditional way to get out of tough middle game is to exchange pieces. So after bishop h6, 8 takes b5, black automatically recaptured with e5. Now white played knight c2. Salov won't have another opportunity to capture the knight. Adams prevent Adams prevents the harm to his pawn arrangement that comes with capturing on bishop takes e4, f takes e4. He retains the knight to control the black's pawns. This also prevents black from executing the move b4, which would have led to weakening and removing the vulnerable b5 pawn. Queen d7. Black keeps the white rook out of 7th rank, but there is also the 6th rank. So white played rook a6. Already Salav must meet the threat of bishop takes e6, f takes e6, rook takes d6. So after rook a6, black played bishop h3. It appears to be an attacking move, but it's actually a final attempt to gain time and strengthen the position by targeting the white rook. Rook e1. Carefully does it. If bishop g2 would uncover an attack on d6 and threaten rook takes d6, but after bishop takes g2, king takes g2, queen b7 check, white has suddenly lost a rook. It's a double attack. So white played carefully, rook e1, bishop g5. As nothing is happening on the king side, the bishop begins a journey to the queen side in search of an aggressive role. Knight b4. The white knight's path becomes clearer as it's drawn towards the beneficial outpost on d5. Bishop d8. No doubt black was wishing he had exchanged. He is wandering bishop for the powerful white knight, even when he had the chance on the back on move 20. So bishop d8, bishop e4, an all-purpose move which vacates the d5 square for the white knight, clears the way to threaten rook takes d6 with the support of the queen, introduces the idea of an attack on h7. Black played bishop b6. The bishop blocks the rook's attack on d6 and hopes to generate play against f2. Knight d5. But white's reply is crushing. After a long wait, the knight finally reaches the ideal square it was denied earlier for strategic reasons on move 18. Since then, the situation for the black bishop has worsened. Black cannot allow bishop d8 to retreat again due to the threat of queen h5, aiming to checkmate on h7, followed by f6 and then rook ea1. With plans for rook a7, this forces black to rely on the tactical ideas to maintain his position. And instead of f6, if f5, the bishop on h3 is lost by queen takes h3. So after knight d5, black played f5. This move is essential in black's Sveshnikov strategy, but in this situation, it appears more as a desperate move rather than a carefully planned idea. Knight captured b6. The tactical point of black's last move is that it seems as if white is just winning a piece, but after queen d8, he has two pieces hanging which can't defend each other. Knight d7, good move. Still, hoping for an easy two-move solution for black's tough situation would be logical, so it's not unexpected that white can take an important pawn and keep their advantages. Queen takes d7, a necessary recapture as black rooks were targeted. Rook takes d6. After seemingly endless pressure, white nets his first material gain. Queen e7. The queen hurries to the king side, trying to strengthen the weakened defenses around the king. Rook d7. And the rook lands on the 7th rank with support of the queen. Queen g5. The queen must prevent queen h5 by white when either the bishop on h3 drops or catastrophe follows on h7. So black had to play queen g5 to stop queen h5. Bishop c2. Now the e5 pawn is hanging If rook f e8, then f4, e takes f4, queen d4 check, king g8, bishop b3 check. Here we see why the bishop was placed on c2. King f8 and then queen h8 check, queen g8, queen takes g8, and it's a checkmate. So after bishop c2, now black played e4. This at least creates a strong block against the white bishop, but the white rooks and queen can now freely move along the 7th rank. Queen d4 check. The queen heads for a7 with gain of time. Queen f6. This shows how dire black's situation is when the best he can hope for is to defend a bad endgame after queen takes f6, rook takes f6. Queen a7. Adams isn't interested in the endgame as he knows that his onslaught along black's second rank will soon be irresistible. Queen h6, supporting the h7. Rook a1. The other rook hurries to join in the fun on the 7th rank. b4. A last gasp of activity by black that white quite rightly ignores. Queen d4 check. Another queen check on d4, and this time it clears the way for the rook to reach a7. Queen f6. Back again, but this time white has no need to avoid the exchange of queens. Rook a7. Adams' exceptional grasp of position is evident in his ability to outmaneuver strong opponents in this manner. Queen takes d4. There was no longer any way to defend h7. C takes d4. Black resigned because not only was their position severely compromised, but they also had no response to imminent threat of checkmate in two moves, starting with rook takes h7 check, king g8, and rook a g7 checkmate, which doesn't even allow for the saving of the bishop on h3. So principles learned, or some principles to keep in mind: occupy the center with pawns, develop your pieces towards rapidly towards the center, develop knights before bishops, castle as early as possible, avoid having weak pawns like isolated, doubled, or backward pawns. Often the square in front of a backward pawn is a greater weakness than the pawn itself. Maneuver an ill-posted piece to a better post as soon as possible. Thank you for watching. I hope you liked this video as well. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel. See you in the next video. Thank you. Bye-bye.